Lüneburg, Germany, the 17th of September 1945. The building is a gymnasium, not a courthouse, a school gymnasium, requisitioned by the British Army because nothing else in the town was big enough. The floor still has the painted lines of a basketball court underneath the tables. 45 people file in and sit down in rows. Each one wears a large square of white cloth pinned to their chest, with a number printed on it. The British did this deliberately. Most of the witnesses about to testify had spent years being reduced to numbers themselves. Number 9 is a woman. She is 21 years old, blonde, composed, sitting very straight. Photographers lean over the rail to get her face. And here is the first thing I need you to understand, before we go any further. Almost everything you have ever read about that woman is wrong, including the name on the front of this video. She was never called the Beast of Belsen. Not by the British soldiers who arrested her, not by the court that condemned her. That name belonged to the man sitting 2 seats away from her. Her name was Irma Grese. And within 3 months she would be dead, hanged in a prison at Hameln, the youngest woman executed under British law in the entire 20th century. But hold that thought, because there's a second thing about that courtroom that almost nobody mentions, and it is genuinely difficult to believe. The indictment, the actual legal document listing the charges against all 45 of them, did not contain the word Jew. Not once. 6 million people. The first war crimes trial of the entire Second World War, 2 months before Nuremberg even opened. And on paper, the crime had no victims with a name. That changed on the 5th day. It changed because of one woman sitting in the public rows waiting to be called. She was 33 years old. She had been in that courtroom for a week, and when they finally swore her in and asked her a routine procedural question about her nationality, she did not give them the answer they were expecting. Before any of this, she was a dentist. Her name was Ada Bimko. She was born in August 1912 in Sosnowiec, an industrial town in southern Poland. Coal, steel, textile mills, the kind of place where the air tasted of iron. Her family were ordinary Polish Jews, not wealthy, not political. She was clever and she was ambitious, and in the 1930s, that combination could still carry a Jewish girl from Sosnowiec a very long way. She went to France. She studied dental surgery at the University of Nancy. She graduated in 1935 with a doctorate, and she came home. Think about what that meant in 1935. A woman, a Jewish woman, a qualified surgeon with a French degree, hanging up a brass plate in her own hometown. She married, she had a son, and then September 1939 happened, and the German army crossed the Polish border, and everything Ada Bimko had built took 4 years to be taken apart. The Jews of Sosnowiec were sealed into a ghetto. Then the ghetto was emptied. On the 2nd of August 1943, Ada Bimko was put on a train with roughly 5,000 other people from her town. Her parents were on that train. Her husband was on that train. Her son was on that train. He was 5.5 years old. The journey took 2 days. They arrived at Auschwitz-Birkenau on the night of the 3rd of August, into the 4th. She described what happened next under oath, in that gymnasium in Lüneburg 2 years later. It took her about a sentence. She was separated from her family on the platform. Her parents, her husband, and her son were sent to the gas chambers. She was not. That is the entire event. One walked down a ramp in the dark, one man's hand pointing left or right, and a family of 5 becomes a woman standing alone. She survived because of her hands. They found out she was medically trained, and they put her to work in the infirmary at Birkenau. And what Ada Bimko then did for 15 months is the reason her name matters more than Irma Grese's ever should have. Prisoners who were sick got sent to the gas chambers. So she hid them. She falsified their condition. She wrote down that dying women were healthy, moved them out of the infirmary before the selections came through, smuggled in medicine, bandaged wounds so they would not be noticed. She was, at the time, working under the medical authority of Josef Mengele. Every single day, for 15 months, she lied to men who could have killed her for it in 5 seconds. And somewhere in that camp, in the women's sector, on the ramp, at the roll calls, at the selections, she kept seeing the same young blonde supervisor, 19 years old. Immaculate uniform, carrying a whip. Hold that image. the doctor and the guard, in the same camp, in the same year, one of them 19 and one of them 31. Because to understand how Irma Grese got to that ramp, we have to go somewhere that looks nothing at all like Auschwitz. A dairy farm in Mecklenburg, northern Germany, 1923. Recken was a village of a few hundred people, 50 miles north of Berlin, flat country, cattle and beet fields, and a Lutheran church. Alfred Grese and his wife Bertha worked with dairy cattle. They had 5 children. Irma was the third, born on the 7th of October, 1923. Her sister Helene later described her, and the description is not what you would expect. Helene said her sister was a coward, that she ran away from fights, that other children at school picked on her and she never fought back. Then her mother died. The accounts disagree on the year. Some say 1932, some say 1936, which would make Irma either 9 or 12. What they agree on is the manner. Bertha Grese discovered that her husband was having an affair with a local girl, and she killed herself by drinking acid. The father went on with the affair. He married the girl a few years later. Now, I want to be careful here, because this is exactly the point where a lot of documentaries about Irma Grese go badly wrong. They present the mother's death as the explanation, the trauma that made the monster. It isn't an explanation. It can't be. Hundreds of thousands of German children lost parents in that decade and did not end up on a ramp at Birkenau. It's a fact about her life. It is not a reason, and anyone who offers it to you as a reason is selling you something. What we can document is much more mundane and much more disturbing. We can document it because she testified. She sat in that dock in 1945 and gave the court her own account of her working life, and it is one of the strangest documents to come out of the entire trial. She left elementary school in 1938, aged 14 or 15, with almost no qualifications. She spent 6 months doing agricultural labor on a farm, then 6 months working in a shop in the town of Leichen. Then, aged 15, she went to a hospital at Hohenleichen, an SS sanatorium, and stayed 2 years. She wanted to train as a nurse. She applied. She was refused. She didn't have the education for it. So the labor exchange sent her to work in a dairy in Fürstenberg, and in July 1942 she tried, one more time, to become a nurse. And here is the line from her own testimony that I cannot get out of my head. She told the court that instead of nursing, the labor exchange sent her to Ravensbrück concentration camp, and she added 4 words. She said she had protested against it. Now, is that true? Almost certainly not in the way she wanted the court to hear it. She had been in the League of German Girls. She was, by every account, a committed believer, and the file at Ravensbrück records a volunteer. But set aside whether she was lying for a moment and look at the shape of the story she chose to tell, because she chose the most boring defense imaginable. Not, I was following orders. Not, I didn't know. She said, this was my job placement. And the horrifying thing is that for thousands of German women, that was close to the literal truth. Fürstenberg, the dairy town she was sent to, is where Ravensbrück is. She was already living next door to it. The camp was the local employer. Here is the part of this story that almost no channel covers, and it is the part your history teacher never got to. The women who guarded the Nazi camps were not in the SS. They couldn't be. The SS did not admit women as members, so the camp system created a separate category for them. SS Gefolge, the SS retinue, civilian auxiliaries, female overseers, Aufseherinnen, employed on contract. They were recruited by newspaper advertisement, actual job adverts in actual German newspapers offering work at a reformatory, light duties, uniform and accommodation provided, and wages that were meaningfully better than a shift in a textile mill. Around 3,500 women took that job. They were not, for the most part, ideologues from good families. They were shop girls, tram conductors, factory workers, hairdressers, women in their 20s from working-class towns taking a step up in pay. And Ravensbrück was the school. That is what the camp functioned as from 1942 onwards, the training establishment. New recruits arrived, were issued the gray uniform, and learned the job on live prisoners, how to run a roll call, how to search a barracks, how to punish. Irma Grese arrived there in July 1942, aged 18. 8 months later, in March 1943, she was transferred to Auschwitz-Birkenau. She was 19 years old, and she had just been posted to the largest killing site in human history. She was there for almost 2 years, and in that time she rose, first to Aufseherin over a sector, then to Rapportführerin, a senior overseer running roll calls and work details across the women's camp. By the time Ada Bimco was watching her on the ramp, Irma Grese was one of the highest-ranking women in Birkenau. She was 20. So, what did she actually do? I'm going to be careful with this, because the record here divides into things that were proved in court and things that people invented afterwards, and the difference matters enormously. What multiple witnesses testified to, under oath, in front of a British military tribunal, with British defense lawyers cross-examining them, she carried a whip. She admitted this herself. She said she had made it, and she gave the court a description of it. What she disputed was what she used it for. She kept dogs, trained, and kept hungry. Witnesses described her setting them on prisoners. She was present at selections. This is the one that mattered legally, and it is the one the prosecution went after hardest, because it is the difference between brutality and murder. Standing on the ramp or at the door of a block and pointing, this column lives, this column goes to the gas. Several survivors testified they saw her do exactly that, and she shot prisoners. That allegation, too, was made in that courtroom, by named witnesses, on the stand. Now here's what I am not going to do. I am not going to spend the next 4 minutes describing individual acts of cruelty in detail, because that is what almost every video about this woman does, and it is the single reason the historical record about her is such a mess. The moment you turn a war crimes trial into a highlight reel of sadism, you stop making history and start making entertainment. And people have been making entertainment out of Irma Grese since about 1946. We'll come back to that. It is genuinely one of the strangest stories in post-war publishing. What I want you to hold on to instead is a number, 30,000. That's roughly how many women were held in the sector of Birkenau she had authority over. 30,000 human beings under the day-to-day control of a 20-year-old former dairy assistant who had failed to qualify as a nurse. That is not a story about one evil woman. That is a story about a system that handed absolute power over 30,000 lives to whoever answered the advert. In January 1945, the Soviets were closing on Auschwitz, and the Germans emptied it westward. Grese went back to Ravensbrück, briefly. Then, in the early spring of 1945, she was posted to a camp in Lower Saxony that until recently had been considered one of the softer postings in the system, Bergen-Belsen. Belsen was not a killing center. There were no gas chambers there. It had begun as a prisoner of war camp, then a holding camp, then an exchange camp for Jews the Reich thought it might trade. And then, in the last 4 months of the war, it became something with no name at all. As the eastern camps were evacuated, the transports came west. Belsen was designed for a few thousand. By April 1945, it held around 60,000 people. No functioning water supply. Almost no food. Typhus spreading through barracks packed beyond any capacity to describe. People were not being murdered at Belsen in an organized way. They were simply being left to die, at a rate of hundreds a day. Ada Bimco was moved there too, in November 1944, and she did the same thing she had done at Birkenau. She was put in charge of a group of children, orphans, most of them, children whose parents were already dead, and through that final winter, with typhus tearing through the camp, she and a handful of other prisoners kept them alive. 149 children, not a few. Not a symbolic gesture, 149. Remember that number when we get to the sentencing. Because in that same camp, in those same months, Irma Grese was working as Arbeitsdienstführerin, labor service leader, organizing work details out of a population that was starving to death. The two of them were there together at the end, the doctor and the guard, one last time, and then, on the 15th of April 1945, British tanks came up the road. The British 11th Armored Division reached Belsen on the 15th of April. Every account by every soldier who was there begins the same way. Not with what they saw, with what they smelled, from a mile out, before the camp was even visible through the trees. Then they came through the wire. Around 60,000 people were still alive inside. Around 13,000 bodies lay unburied on the ground. And here is a detail that stops people cold, because it doesn't fit the shape of the story we expect. The SS staff were still there. They had not run. Josef Kramer, the commandant, walked out to meet the British and formally handed the camp over. Irma Grese was still at her post. Why? Because there had been a deal. The typhus epidemic terrified the German command more than the British army did. If 60,000 infected people scattered across Lower Saxony ahead of an advancing front, the disease would go everywhere, so a local truce was negotiated. The Wehrmacht agreed to hand the camp over intact, and a portion of the staff were ordered to remain and assist the transfer. She didn't stay out of courage, and she didn't stay out of ignorance. She stayed because she was told to. Right to the end, the job placement. The British put the SS staff to work burying the dead and then arrested them, and the medical catastrophe was only beginning. A British brigadier named Glyn Hughes took charge of the relief effort, and 2 days after liberation, he appointed a prisoner to organize medical care among the survivors. He appointed Dr. Ada Bimco. She assembled 28 doctors and more than 600 volunteers from among the inmates, people who had themselves been starving a week earlier. In the 2 months after liberation, despite everything they did, another 13,944 people died at Bergen-Belsen. Now, the myths. I promised you this, and it's important, because by the time the trial opened in September, the British press had already decided who the story was about, and they had already got the facts wrong in ways that have never been corrected. Start with the name. The Beast of Belsen was Josef Kramer, the commandant. That was the tabloid nickname, and the newsreels used it. Josef Kramer, whom the world calls the Beast of Belsen. It was his. Grace's press nickname was different. She was the Hyena of Auschwitz. Later in the paperbacks, the Beautiful Beast. The two names have been merged and swapped for 80 years, and the reason is not complicated. Kramer was a heavy-set, unremarkable-looking bureaucrat in his late 30s. Grese was 21 and photogenic. One of them sold newspapers. Then there's the lampshade. You have almost certainly heard the story that this woman had lampshades made from human skin. It appears in dozens of articles, and it is repeated as fact constantly. It has nothing to do with Irma Grese. That allegation attaches to Ilse Koch, the wife of the commandant of Buchenwald, in a completely different trial, in a completely different camp, under American jurisdiction, and even there it was contested, and the conviction relating to it was later reduced. It was never charged against Grese. It was never testified to at Lüneburg. It simply migrated, because by the 1950s, notorious Nazi woman had become a single blurred figure in the popular imagination, and details slid freely between them. And then there is the third category, and I'll deal with it in one sentence, because it deserves no more than that. From the late 1950s onward, an entire pulp publishing genre grew up around sexualized fantasies of female camp guards. Cheap paperbacks first, then a run of exploitation films in the 1970s. Irma Grese was its central template. Almost none of what those books and films depict has any basis in the trial record whatsoever. Which brings us back to that gymnasium. The Belsen Trial opened on the 17th of September, 1945, 2 months before Nuremberg. It ran for 54 days in court, 45 defendants, 32 SS men and women, and around a dozen capos, prisoners who had been given supervisory roles over other prisoners. One defendant became too ill to continue and was withdrawn. Prosecution was led by Colonel Backhouse, and the defense, this is the part that always lands hardest with a British audience, the defense was conducted by serving British Army officers, regular officers, some of them solicitors before the war. They were handed these clients, given very little time, and told to defend them properly. Irma Grese's defense counsel was Major Cranfield, and he did his job. He cross-examined survivors of Auschwitz on the details of their memories, dates, distances, whether they could really have seen a face at that range, whether they were confusing one blonde guard with another, You may find that obscene. I'd ask you to consider the alternative. The reason the Belsen trial is still cited as a landmark is precisely that it wasn't a formality. And now the fifth day. The prosecution called Dr. Ada Bimco. She was sworn in, and Colonel Backhouse began, as he had with previous witnesses, with the routine identification. Her nationality, Polish. She did not accept the question as framed. She identified herself, on the record, in a British military court, as a Jewess from Poland. 4 words. And with them, the word that the entire indictment had somehow managed to avoid entered the trial, and the proceedings changed character permanently. Over 2 days she described Birkenau, the selections, the gas chambers, which many people in that room, and many people reading the papers the next morning, were hearing about in detail for the very first time. The infirmary, the medical experiments, then Belsen, and the winter, and the children. An observer from the World Jewish Congress had written despairingly on the opening day that the indictment did not mention Jews at all. Ada Bimco fixed that from the witness box. The court deliberated for 6 hours. 30 of the defendants were convicted on at least one charge. 14 were acquitted outright and walked free. 19 received prison sentences ranging from 1 year to life, and 11 were sentenced to death. Sit with those numbers, because this is the question the whole trial leaves behind. 14 acquittals, in a case about Bergen-Belsen and Auschwitz. Germans at the time were genuinely startled by it. Most had assumed anyone charged would be convicted automatically. The British press treated it as proof that the rule of law had survived the war. And of the 19 prison sentences, most were substantially reduced on appeal or by pardon within a few years. A great many of those people were out and living ordinary lives by the early 1950s. Irma Grese was convicted on both counts, for Belsen and for Auschwitz. Sentence of death. She appealed. The appeal was refused. The condemned were moved to the prison at Hamelin, the town from the Pied Piper story, in the second week of December. On the 12th, each of them was weighed and measured. This was standard British procedure. The hangman needed the body weight to calculate the length of the drop, so that death would be instant. The executioner was Albert Pierrepoint, the most prolific British hangman of the century. 13 people were hanged at Hamelin on the 13th of December, 1945. 11 from the Belsen trial, and 2 men condemned in a separate case for murdering an RAF officer. Pierrepoint executed the 3 women first, one at a time. Irma Grese was the first of the 13. He wrote about it later, in his memoirs, and his account has been reprinted so many times it's become the standard ending to her story. He called her name in the corridor. The cell was too small to work in, so he pinioned her outside it. She followed him. At 34 minutes past 9 in the morning, she walked into the execution chamber, looked around at the officials standing there, and walked onto the chalk mark he had made on the trapdoor. She stood on it without being placed. As he put the white cap over her head, she said one word, "Schnell." Quickly, he obliged. The drop fell. A doctor followed him into the pit and pronounced her dead, and after 20 minutes she was taken down and buried in the prison yard. She was 22 years old, so why is she the only one anybody remembers? 45 people sat in that gymnasium. Around 3,500 women worked as camp overseers across the entire system. At Bergen-Belsen alone, the staff numbered at least 480, of whom around 45 were women. Almost none of them were ever tried. Not at Lüneburg, not anywhere. Most went home. They married, took their husbands' names, and lived out ordinary German lives in ordinary German towns, shop assistants and tram conductors again, drawing pensions into the 1980s and 1990s, while the woman they had trained alongside became a figure in pulp novels. A handful were prosecuted, decades late, when they were very old. Some of those cases were still going in recent years. Ada Bimco married Josef Rosensaft in 1946 and spent the rest of her life making sure the testimony survived. She died in 1997. And Irma Grese got the name, the paperbacks, the films, and the myth, because she was young and photogenic and 22 and hanged. Which means the story we've been told for 80 years isn't really about the worst person in that room. It's about the one who was easiest to look at. The rest of them went home.